Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. We have an amazing panel gathered together here to talk about better health and data. And to get us started, I'd love to ask each of our panelists to do a quick introduction of themselves. And Shobana, may I start with you?
Hi. I'm from the Apollo Hospitals Group in India, highly diversified. We have more than 10,000 super specialty beds in operation across the country, but we also have, little known fact, 5,000 pharmacies and a TPA business, diagnostics, and now digital health platform that actually reaches, we have more than 20 million people registered on it. Started during COVID.
Thank you, Shobana. Christoph.
I'm Christoph Weber, the CEO of Takeda Pharmaceuticals. We are a large pharmaceutical company, science-driven R&D, and we discover and develop life-saving, in most cases, life-saving medicines. We are present in 80 countries. I'm very looking forward to the discussion today.
I'm Elizabeth Teisberg, and I too am delighted to be here. I am co-founder of the Value Institute for Health and Care at the University of Texas at Austin. We work with groups that are transforming care, and we have a series of executive education and master's degree programs on how to implement transformation.
Nikolai.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nikolai Gilbert, the CEO of PATH, which is a global non-for-profit public health NGO operating as well in 70 countries and with around 3,000 staff all around the world.
Thank you so much. Well, I know we will learn a lot from our panelists today, and let me just tee up the discussion that we'll have. We know one thing for sure, and that is that the COVID-19 pandemic really identified a number of vulnerabilities in our public health system and public health infrastructure. And there is no question about the fact that data is very critical to identify vulnerabilities, to be able to create mitigation strategies and prioritize those strategies for implementation. And each of our panelists today have incredible experience and perspectives on the importance of data in driving better health. And I'll just give you a little background about myself. I'm the CEO of the American Heart Association, where data is a critical component of the work we do every single day. We use data to capture the standard of care being delivered to the guidelines we write in the United States. We capture data to help improve performance of healthcare systems compared with each other, and to allow us to recognize systems that are delivering high quality care. And during the pandemic, because we recognize the importance of data, we immediately launched a COVID-19 registry in the United States, maximizing the relationships and contracts we already had with 2,600 US hospitals that capture data for us on a range of things like stroke and heart failure, atrial fibrillation. So very early on, we were able to capture tremendously valuable data on what was happening in hospitals and what were the characteristics of the patients that were diagnosed with COVID being treated in hospital. And so I think from our experience and from what you'll hear from the panelists, we certainly know that data can make a tremendous difference. And so what we would like to do is to start by talking about some of the issues and opportunities from each of your points of view. And Shobana, let me start with you, if I might. I know that you have some insights on the circle of data and how we can use it better for patients, for providers, for public health. And tell us how this connects with some of the alliances that you have in your country.
Sure. So one thing is that all of you who clearly know that when it comes to data, the importance of really making sure that it is good data, because we can just, today the world, 30% of all the data that you collect in the world happens to be healthcare. And this is growing at a CAGR of 36%. And every single hospital or pharmaceutical or everybody, they say that they've layered AI into their system. But what does that mean for the patient unless we can use it effectively? So one of the use cases is that we did a project with Microsoft, And in that project, it was a cardiovascular risk score. So we used we used 50,000, a cohort of 50,000 people who came to our hospitals over almost a 7-year period. And we just looked at that data. And with that, we were able to see, and these were all heart patients. And we said, and with that, we were able to predict, do a Asian heart risk score. So, just with, so it's early indicator of heart disease if they fall into a certain pattern, and actually it's being used in several countries outside India also by Microsoft. And I think this is one area, but it's just one use case. But the most exciting to me, and as Nancy said, you can't, partnerships are very important, partnerships with good companies that understand how to use data, because hospital systems can provide a lot of it, and much of it you can't use, and it keeps coming. Like you're going to get it from connected devices when they're in the hospital, when they're outside, as you monitor them. But how do you come together with good partners to put it to best use? And I think for that, I'm on the board of something that the WEF initiated called the Edison Alliance. So Edison Alliance has a challenge in 5 years. By 2025, we'll touch 1 million people, give them digital access, better financial, through financial inclusion. And these are the people who are marginal and left out. So, while I gave you a used case of people who can afford to come into the hospital, what are the millions and probably billions that don't have access? So through digital inclusion, financially, how can we connect them? And then digital education. And then the third pillar is healthcare. So we did a model, and this is a model that is working in Madhya Pradesh, 5 digital dispensaries. And with, most people are really shocked when I give you this number, but for $10 a year, we're able to take 250,000 people and give them, first we map what they have to do the first, we do the initial mapping. Then we give them whatever diagnostic, the basic diagnostic, blood work and x-rays, whatever they need. And then if they have any disease conditions, we actually give them, we give them medicines. And so what this has done is that over a big cohort like this, you're able to deliver using data. And we could not have done it if we didn't have a teleconsult, if we didn't have the ability to do point of care that comes in, and you're able to kind of predict ahead and do all this modeling. So I think data is super important, because one is that it'll bring out better, more equity in healthcare. It'll be available for all. But overall, we can actually use this not only to be smarter, but we can bring down the huge costs of healthcare.
Yeah. That, as you know, you and I had a discussion about this the other day. I'm so intrigued by this model, and I think we all can learn so much. How will you plan to capture that data as in terms of outcomes of that model and share it with others?
So one is that, the data that we have is really, I think there's so many different countries have different, this thing, regulations on data privacy and how you do it. And I, as a healthcare provider, definitely feel that there's much work to be done on data privacy for the patient. But what we can do, and what the government did in India, for instance, there's a CoWIN app during the same time COVID, and 100 million people are on that. So it's got a lot of data, but how can we anonymize it and use, I think that this is the time when this blockchain technology will actually start working well for healthcare, because if you can anonymize it and still get the right parts of it to be able to use this for proper analysis. And believe me, Nancy, I think at this time, maybe a couple of years from now, things are moving so fast. A lot of it is extraneous. We really can't do proper use cases.
Well, we'll come back in a couple of years and we'll hear from you what ideas you have. We'll hold you to that. Nikolai, let me come down to you. We know that there were many lessons learned on data in the pandemic, specifically in terms of data velocity and its significance in differing types of economies, developed and emerging markets. Your perspectives on that, and what have we learned?
That's a big question. What
It
have we learned?
is.
We've learned a lot. Let me take the lens of health equity to answer that question, and actually how data and lack of data transparency has also worsened health equity during the pandemic. Because the lack of clear information, sufficient information at a global level, that lack of transparency had impacts on vaccines, it had impacts on PPE, protective material, diagnostics, medical supplies, and so on. Because the lack of information for global decision makers meant that hoarding took place at a massive scale. Because decision makers were lacking information, they overbought. They overbought vaccines and other countermeasures to the pandemic. And that is why this topic is so important. Because, and this affected both developing countries, emerging markets, and everyone. And one example which came further in the pandemic was the lack of oxygen. So oxygen came kind of like in a second wave of PPE, vaccines, and so on. But because of what happened in India, suddenly there was a lens on oxygen and how that is a life-saving commodity that every facility needs to have access to. But this was not, we didn't have the data, we didn't have the supply overview. So one of the things that we did was to create a global tracker on oxygen so you could see which countries had access, which ones had not, and also within countries, for example, in India, who suffered really a bad pandemic at that point in time, how could we help increase that supply of oxygen? And we did the same on the diagnostics, also trying to create transparent information that could help decision makers to make decisions on how to move the restricted supply around. So I would say on the lessons learned that without data, without information and transparent information, we all suffer and we cannot solve global challenges. And geopolitics and the environment we're working in right now is not helpful, because what geopolitics does is that it means people hold on to information. And that's actually hurting health equity at a massive scale, and also hurts scientific progress across the science community. So what we need to learn and do better is that when we hopefully will have more geopolitical stability and quiet time, that we build the foundation for better information and data sharing across all the aspects that I mentioned before. And we need that quiet time to actually get everyone around the table and raise this issue of data sharing and transparency.
What do you think is what would motivate people to want to share data and to have that level of transparency, which of course is a goal we all aspire to? Do you have any thoughts about what it will take?
No, I think many people in this room actually has been very vocal on the importance of it. So obviously, if we don't share data, every population suffers. So when a decision maker in a government is holding on to information, it might come back and hurt their own population. And I think that should be the motivation factor for sharing. And that's why the geopolitical aspects of it is so important.
Great, thank you. Christoph, I'd love to come to you. I know that you have been very focused on the integration of connecting data, climate, and health. And I wonder if you could talk to us in the context of global data gathering, where have these investments shown fruitful in evidence-based decisions at your organization to drive better health outcomes?
Yeah, first it's a very timely discussion because we never had so much data available on health. It's a technological revolution that is driving this data access. For decades, we tried to have patient electronic record. It never worked very well because the technology was not ready. So now is the time because we have this data that we can aggregate. There is technology to aggregate the data, which we didn't have before. So the volume of data that we we can generate is absolutely enormous. So it can really improve patient outcome. You can use the data to diagnose better disease. It starts there. Many diseases are underdiagnosed. At Takeda, we do a lot of research in rare disease. It's very common that a rare disease will take 15 years to be diagnosed. With data, we can accelerate that diagnosis. We can, therefore, accelerate recruitment in clinical trial, for example, so we can accelerate innovation. Data is also a great way to improve outcome of treatments. I give you an example. We have developed an application using a lot of data to predict flare of a disease. So the patient is treated, but they have an application which helps them to predict when they will get a flare, and they can adjust their treatment based on that data and this AI algorithm, which is also used to do that. So you can see that you can really improve outcome. And of course, while you can measure better the outcome, you can measure better the efficiency of the healthcare provider, the healthcare systems. So it is completely transforming the overall healthcare ecosystem. It is transforming the pharmaceutical industry. Now, I think what is very important is a clear agreement with people about what we do with the data, who has access to the data, what type of benefit they will get. There's been already a lot of issues. So if we are not careful in the utilization of this data, and healthcare is very sensitive, we'll have some pushback from people. And there has been already this type of situation happening because we have seen people giving consent to someone, to an organization, but then this organization provides the information to someone else, and the patient didn't know about that. And so we need to be very careful about how the transparency and how we are using this data.
Yeah, because trust is so important. Shabana?
So,
Yeah, in fact, I think that it's a bit, right now, everybody thinks that data is your ability to do something, to have a business model, that it's worth so much more, They have not figured out what it is, but everyone wants to guard their data because they think it's a competitive advantage. So till we can figure out, no one is going to give you things, Nikolai, because everyone thinks it's theirs, and how can they find a way to monetize it? Because I know I generate 200 million prescriptions a year, and every single pharma company wants to come and ask me for data, and we don't give it. But the thing is that at some time, if we can find out a way that diffuse that tension, and find a way, like you said, Christophe, that if there's an economic model that you can measure and this thing, and then the sharing can happen, because there are points that have really good data with this. And so I think till that time, so that's why I think we need to come together. When you spoke about partnerships, that quiet time to sit around the table, the geopolitics will always be there. But unless we figure out ways to do this ourselves, and I think that would become very powerful.
Nikolai, jump in.
I think it's a good point, because there are data that are for the public good, because it is about responding to pandemics and disease outbreaks and so on. And then there are data that are private at a patient level, and it's fundamentally two different things. But you need to have an aggregation level which anonymize basically the patient information data as you move to the next level. I think that's
Our government is trying to do it, but everyone is kind of scared because, what happens if the security?
Do you think are the owners of the data, the individuals, scared, or the aggregators of the data, like your health system?
I think both, because the Indian government is really aggressive to say that we're building the data health stack. In many ways, it'll be good. And the way that you described it, you split up what is required for public good, and then what is the private data. If we can really make that happen, and create that secure layer, but who can promise security?
That's a good and interesting question. I think we all aspire to security, that's for sure. Christophe, speaking of security and trust, just to come back on something, you talked about the app as an example, that patients can track their own flare-up of a certain disease state. Tell us a little bit more. How have, obviously, if I were a patient that had a disease that had a flare-up, I would see the benefit in having the app. Are you able to aggregate that data? You talked about AI. Dig into that a little bit more so we can see, like, how do those patients become involved? Are there issues with trust with them, or is the benefit to them outweigh any concern about data loss or security?
It's a great question. There is always, you need to do it in partnership with organizations that patient trust. Unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry is not very often trusted. So you always do it in partnership so that you can create that trust, and then there is clarity about where the data will be located, in what format, and how it will be used. And then the patient is benefiting from it, but they also know who else is benefiting in the ecosystem. And of course, you need to reinforce the cybersecurity. The anonymization is a must, but it's not always, it's not the minimum, it's not sufficient for patients to be part of it. They want to have the full transparency about how the data will be used, who will benefit from it beside themselves, even if it's anonymized. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes we just say it's anonymized, we can do whatever we want with it, but I don't think that's the case.
Nikolai, did you want to?
No, I just to your point, I think there is also, we also use data in a clinical trial setting, which is also, I think, important. So, and that anonymization of data for individuals that go into human subject research is also critical to get diversity. And when we recruit patients for trials, depending on which country they're in, actually the levels of privacy and data privacy is very different from these countries. So that's another, not wanting to bring more complexity into the discussion, but it's actually important as we try to get more diverse populations into our clinical trials.
That's great. Elizabeth, let me bring you into this discussion. Obviously, you run a very important center focused on value models, and your center is a research center. And certainly we know that you're focused on issues of healthcare delivery, payment reform, and value-based care, all really important issues. Tell us what data is needed to drive transformative change in healthcare value and equity.
Thanks. You made a really important point early on, which is that you have to have the information you need to make good decisions. And there are many different kinds of data, but in this conversation, you've heard people talking about data that's used to make decisions to make your care better or to enable your self-care to be better. And that's different than clinical trials, and it's different than some of the publicly collected, population health data, other data. So thinking about different types of data, but also thinking about the value of information from that data to the patient. So our work is really deeply, it's deeply relationship-centered, but that also means it has to be human-centered or patient-centered. And so the first thing in terms of thinking about what data do you really need for this is to recognize that the purpose of healthcare is to improve the health of the person you're serving or the family that you're serving. So we need to measure the outcomes that are meaningful to the patient and the family. That's the purpose. So if we're not measuring that, then we don't know if we're driving in the direction that we mean to drive. So that's sort of the first thing, is thinking about measuring where we want to go. In healthcare, we often measure the inputs and the costs and the processes, the treatments, without actually measuring, did it achieve what the person came for help for? And so human-centered outcomes are often different from clinical outcomes, or what some people call process outcomes, what treatment was actually given. So I can give you an example of that in breast cancer care, for example. We did a lot of work with women who had had breast cancer. They are the experts in their lived experience with breast cancer. And we got them talking about what did they hope for and what did they fear. And what became crystal clear was that after they realized that they would likely not die of breast cancer, this is for women who didn't have very advanced breast cancer, they had an overwhelming concern, a functional outcome that came up in about 98% of the people who were involved in the study. It wasn't a huge study, but it was big enough that that's really striking. The functional outcome for women with breast cancer that they were so concerned about was cognitive impairment, chemo brain. So as soon as you say it, it makes sense, right? Chemo brain can cause people to lose their jobs, to lose their marriages, to lose, it can be really horrible. And we know a lot about how to minimize chemo brain. There are many double-blind, placebo-controlled trials that give us information that could be being used. But many women said they were never even told that this could happen. So they weren't engaged at all in protecting something that is critically important to them. So there are times when we have a big split between whether we're measuring what matters to the patients and the clinical outcomes being measured. One of our studies was with people who had lived experience with homelessness. And what was overwhelming in that study, the interesting thing about that, was that in that group, in that segment, the concern was about whether they could trust the care and whether they would be respected. So for them, for this group, the concerns about trust and respect overwhelmed their health goals. Safety, compassion, respect should be the floor, not the stretch goal. But for this group, it was the stretch goal. Right? And then another cool example in this is a group in the UK that was deciding to try to achieve better outcomes in psychiatric care, inpatient psychiatric care. And at first they thought, we can't do high-value care, we can't measure outcomes. These are very sick psychiatric patients. And their chief medical officer said, wait a second, these are inpatients, many of them there because of criminal activity. So if we're not improving the outcomes that matter to them, we're kind of incarcerating them. So we have to pay attention to this. So they looked at the outcomes that mattered to the clinical staff, and they were important outcomes. They were safety to self, safety to others, safety of treatment. Those are important things. But the patients presumed that they would be safe in the care of these smart, kind, hardworking doctors, right? And when they were talked to and their family members were talked to, what they wanted was normalcy. They wanted their life back. So safety wasn't the outcome that they were looking for. They presumed it. They assumed it was the floor. They were looking for normalcy. So when we think about from the patient perspective, do we have the data we need to be sure we're driving in the direction we want to go, that we actually can take steps toward achieving what healthcare is there to achieve, and to support the professionalism of clinicians who want to be getting their patients better. We need to be thinking about whether we actually have these patient-centered outcomes in our mix. We need to track our processes, we need to track the clinical outcomes, and we need to make sure that those things are working in service of the purpose of healthcare in helping and healing.
It's such an important point, and it really leads to another question I have for each of you. If you just shut your eyes for a minute and think, since we've been here this week, the amount of data in the world is just multiplied, especially healthcare data. Yet our ability to use that in a way that can affect change for patients becomes more and more complicated as the tools get more sophisticated, as concerns about security become more sophisticated. So if you had one dream or one wish or one way you would like to change or affect the system, what would that be? And Nikolai, let me start with you.
I'm the lucky one to
You're
start
the
that
lucky
question.
one. Maybe I'll say, what would your top priority be? You know, what would your dream or your top priority be?
Yeah, that we would all believe in the scientific data that are presented to us, and that people trust the data, either on an individual level, on a macro level, because obviously, as you also pointing to, we need to make sure we measure the right things, both at the macro and the patient level. But that if people don't feel that the data that they are presented with represents their interest, then the chain is broken a bit. So actually, my biggest wish is that people would actually have more trust. And that's a big ask in the current environment.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
We can get to that trust. I would go for equity. I would go for
Talk to us more about that. Tell
for
us.
health equity.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you think about it, right now, we know there are huge variations in care processes and care outcomes any place you measure it. The distributions are very wide, and it's not just a few outliers. We have these wide distributions. If we, instead of looking, so we tend to simplify because we've got so much data. We tend to simplify by looking at the averages and trying to move the averages. Instead, if we look at that distribution and say, let's focus hard on what's going on in the lower part of that distribution, people who are getting less good outcomes for all the effort that we're putting in, and ask what's driving that and change that care. So it might be resources, it might be things that we think about as social determinants of health. It might be that the care doesn't actually fit the real lives of the people in that segment. And we often see that. If you think about it, if we wanted to make sure that you were all appropriately clothed, we could start by giving everybody shoes, and we'll make them all size 8 to be equal. Okay, that won't work, right? You won't achieve equity doing that, right? So we have to look at what are the needs of the people who are less well served and design care to actually address that. Then we'll add to our array of care and ensure that more people actually achieve good outcomes. And we can do that, but it takes a different attitude than we have now. Healthcare, maybe more than any sector I've worked in, is just full of smart, caring, hardworking people. So if we give the relevant data and tools to people to correct the inequity, they'll act.
Do you think the current incentive or recognition programs that look at people providing high quality of care prevent people from being honest about the data at the lower end of the spectrum, or do you think it's just not captured and or reported that way? I'm just trying to, what is stopping it from happening now, and how do we fix that problem?
I think what's stopping is we're actually not measuring outcomes most of the time. So in heart care, it's 2 decades ahead of most of medicine. And so, and then there are some other areas in transplant care, the outcome measurement is well ahead. And ironically, in vitro fertilization, the outcome data is ahead. But in many of the areas, we're not actually measuring the outcomes. And so it's like driving blind. It's like putting a film across your windshield and say, go. We need to know, where we're trying to go. One of the things that I think was counterintuitive early in our work, but it makes more sense to me now. I thought if we were telling people to share this data and they were concerned that it was going to go public and that they might not look as good as their reputation might be, that they might hold back. But what we've really found is that the people who are doing the most to put their data out there and to teach other people how to achieve better results learn more in the process of teaching. And so their outcomes are actually improving faster, so you get the lower tail of the distribution comes up, and the upper tail of the distribution stretches out. So instead of something more like a normal curve, you have more good outcomes, and then the leaders who are doing the teaching and sharing pulling out in front. It's super well documented in the work on cystic fibrosis, which is a very well-known story. But the people who got out there and taught others how do you do it not only drove the average survival, from 18 to 35 to, 54 at the best places, but that achieving of those best outcomes came from the places that were out in front, teaching other people how to improve.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for that. Christoph, what would be your big dream, your priority, your call to action?
So I'm very optimistic about the positive impact that I will have in the future. But there will be, I'll talk about my fear as well. I'm optimistic because the data that we have and we will have more and more will allow us to measure outcome. And many healthcare systems were not designed by outcomes. They were designed on other metrics, geographical presence, and they were not incentivized at all to provide good outcome. With the data available, I think it will be impossible to avoid progressively. So that will change a lot the healthcare system. The data also will allow to go more towards personalized care. I would almost say personalized predictive care. So we develop treatment based on statistical average, right? But in fact, everyone responds differently to care. Data will show this trend, this micro trend, and this data combined with AI will allow us to do predictive care at a personal level. And I think it will change completely the way care will happen in the future. So that's really exciting. I have many fear. One is cybersecurity, of course, and trust. Trust is very sensitive. It can be damaged very rapidly. My other fear is that this data will be more available, and you will have the algorithms that are used by social media, for example, reinforcing the information that has to be used very, very carefully. We have seen that with vaccines. The vaccines works for the majority. It might not work for a few. If you have an algorithm expanding that information that this person had these problems, very rapidly you destroy the trust. And we've seen that with COVID. We are about to launch a vaccine against dengue. That's a major issue. So, and I don't know how to solve that. But this is not that this data can be misused, can be even weaponized by countries against other countries. So that's a real fear I have.
Yeah. Thank you. Shobana, dream, aspiration.
So I agree with everything that has been said by Nicholas, Elizabeth, and Christoph. And I do believe that equity is at the bottom of whatever we do. Foundationally, you do not want to use this data to benefit just a few. So the personalization should come to just about everybody. And in doing so, I want us to move up to some bigger challenges, because what is this data? Now we've let that bird is out of the cage. These things are going to fly, and they're going to fly fast and furiously. So when it's there, let's look for the big problems. So one is solving equity, keeping costs down. So we have to identify those big challenges. But more than anything else, we have to address things like, the world is going to have 8 billion plus people in it. They're going to start living longer. Can the world really afford? And this is what data will be able to do. They'll be able to create, better longevity, a quality of life of how we can increase the quality of life, how we can, not take down nations. Like if you look at a country like India with 1.4 billion people, predisposed to heart disease and hypertension and diabetes, cancer. And all of a sudden, we're a $3 trillion GDP, and you get a bill for $1 trillion that you have to spend on NCDs. You can't afford it. With this, nations will continue to be poor with this. So what are those big challenges to me that data will be able to do to be able to solve that early detection, keep them in that, keep your your blood glucose levels lower, because you're constantly tracking it. And believe me, everyone will become a data company for healthcare. It's not just Apple or Google or any Microsoft. All the big ones will see that, when 30% of the world is health data, tell me who wants to be left out of that party. And so it's not just a provider at the end of it. So I think that it's up to groups like us to be able to find out how to make sure that you're solving it. Because all the bad stuff will continue to happen with this. But we do have the ability to use that data to solve some of the really big things. And I don't want that opportunity to get lost.
Because that really is the dream, right? If every person gets ideal care at the right time, or even better, that their risk for any disease is prevented because of early understanding and diagnosis, that would be the dream. And it can happen.
No, it's like imminent.
Yes.
When we meet maybe next year or in this near future, this is not long-term crystal ball gazing.
No.
That we're all there. We put enough checks and balances to make that data really good.
Yes, that's a good point. We have just a couple of moments. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please raise your hand and yes.
Thank you. Megan Greenfield from McKinsey and WEF Young Global Leader. So my question is, we all know that the data in healthcare can unlock amazing opportunities. However, we also know that without a diverse and, frankly, most importantly, a representative data set, we can lead to suboptimal outcomes. As many people know, women die 2x at a rate of men because the way that heart disease shows up is different in women. So what do you recommend, going in, Nikolai mentioned about how he's committed to getting diverse data sets, but how do we make it not just the people who are good and really forward-thinking, but how do we make sure that all of our data is representative so that we actually can come up with the best algorithms?
Elizabeth, would you like to start on that? I know you do a lot of work on equity.
Yeah. So so one size doesn't fit all, and if we treat women as if they were men, and there might be some differences, then we're ignoring really important things, right? So you want to think about it from the perspective of understanding people with shared needs, right? And which is why I said when you want to look at one thing you want to do is look at the lower tail of the distribution and ask, are there shared needs there that need to be addressed? But in general, so you can think about segmenting in the same way, and then we can personalize care better. So again, back to sort of clothes for a moment, right? You can get clothes that fit without having everything customized from the ground up by buying in roughly your size. So if we think about segments of people with shared needs and coming up with consistent care there, then we can personalize around that much more easily than we can if we provide the average care to everybody and try to personalize from there, which will require much more adjustment. So I do think we have to think about what are the segments that would give us big insight and look at what the needs are there.
Yeah, and we need to be intentional as we set out on new, whether it's a new clinical trial, a new registry, whatever, to make sure that we are first including people in the design that represent the populations that need to be served, and then being intentional about collecting the data, I think, is really, really critical. We have a question right up here in front. If you could introduce yourself. Here comes your microphone.
I was going to project. Hello, everyone. I'm Talila Oni. I'm a public health physician, urban epidemiologist, University of Cambridge. I'd love to get your thoughts on primary and secondary prevention and the potential for looking at data, integrating your data within the healthcare sector, but also data outside of the healthcare sector. Because we're talking about outcomes. We know that the majority of factors influence health, outside of healthcare, but the healthcare sector is notoriously very siloed and not connected to, say, environmental determinants. So if we're able to kind of see air pollution spikes and anticipate sort of, reduce exacerbations in patients with asthma, or actually look at the potential for intersectoral data to prevent disease from it occurs. So I'd love to get anyone's thoughts on thinking about the system and how we can better optimize the broader health system so the healthcare plays nice better with the health data from outside of the healthcare sector.
That's a wonderful question. And Siobhan, I'm going to ask you to very quickly, I'm looking
Yeah,
at my
we'll
clock
run out of
that's
time.
flashing red
So-
zeros, but
so-
very quickly, could you answer that?
There'll be different people who do different things, but I landed in Australia and suddenly I saw a huge signboard, a digital signboard that said, the pollution, the pollen level is so much, so please asthmatics be careful. And I think that when communities, so this will be something to do with cities, something to do with communities, and something to do with personal. So we're all going to be empowered with much more of this primary care data with us. And I think that we're just becoming smarter at it, and we're at the cusp. COVID really accelerated that, and I can see a lot more of such
Christophe,
things.
very briefly,
Yeah,
would you like to
very
add on?
briefly. We can aggregate all the data from different sources. That's the beauty of it. I think by doing that, we can do predictive care. Prevention, we struggle always with prevention because we were not predicting what will happen. We can do predictive care now. And I think it will really create a new dimension.
Wonderful, thank you. I am going to, sadly, call this panel to a close. I do want to thank Nikolai, Elizabeth, Christophe, and Shabana, who are amazing leaders in the field of health and healthcare and data. We really appreciate you being here with us today. This conversation will continue, and we look forward to continuing to engage with each of you. Thank you so much.
You're an amazing leader.